Okay, this is the most ludicrous and lunatic set of goals we have today. We are going to try to talk about, in the post-war global city, 1946 to 2001 and beyond, suburbanization, deindustrialization, the decline of the port, the civil rights movement, Nueva York, the war on poverty, the fiscal crisis, the booms of the 1980s and 90s, September 11th, and the future. Will we make it? Stay tuned. Okay. At the end of the Second World War, New York is cooking on all 18 burners. It is the greatest port in the world, and there's every anticipation that it will continue to be. There is a call for the erection of something called a World Trade Center in 1946, which will actually be a merchandise mart where the world will come and display its wares for this massive center of commerce in the years to come. It's a manufacturing giant, once again, with a tremendous amount of research in new cutting-edge stuff as well. Electronics, in fact. Our engineering schools are turning out electrical and electronic engineers. We have every sense of being not only holding our own in many manufacturing areas, but in fact expanding into new and exciting ones. We are a financial powerhouse, slightly weakened by the fact that the federal government itself underwrote much of the cost of this war and didn't quite run through Wall Street the way it had in all the prior wars, but nonetheless, pots of money was made on Wall Street during the war. Our communication facilities, our entertainment, and cultural aspects have been enormously enhanced. We haven't even time to discuss this before, but remember, one of the greatest migrations of intellectual firepower in the history of the world, at least since Constantinople, took place during the war years as artists and physicists and social scientists came in astounding numbers, and many of them stayed and utterly transformed modern art, modern music, higher education, and the rest of it. An incredibly enriching moment, the war years, and after all, not a single bomb fell here. So we emerge in a position of unparalleled power and influence and looking grandly to the future. And were we ever wrong? There were a whole series of events, which actually some of them have been going on for some time, which are, despite this, think about undertows and waves on a beach. Looks good, you see all those waves coming in. But if you're in the wrong place and you walk out even a few inches, you find there's a very powerful undertow going in the opposite direction. And if you don't watch it, you get sucked out and are never seen again. The undertows that are of particular consequence for us are suburbanization and deindustrialization and the collapse of commerce in the port. So 1, 2, 3, suburbanization. Suburbanization has got two kinds of roots. One of them is desire on the part of people who are returning, the 15 million veterans, to cities which have been a mess since the 1930s, and there was no development going on here during the war. And a bright, shiny new vision emerges of single-family houses out in the outer periphery with garden-like areas, and it's safe and secure and green. Who wouldn't want to? Well, actually, a lot of people didn't want to. But in fact, increasingly, a deal was made that you couldn't resist. And there were a variety of ways in which this happened. 1949 Housing Act is the critical piece of legislation here. What happens is something called urban renewal. The vision and the rhetoric sound great. We're going to fix up all these tired cities that have suffered from 20 years at least of neglect. And we're going to do that by bulldozing all these horrible old slums that don't have heat and hot water and all the rest of that stuff, and we're going to construct new, wonderful housing. A little fuzzy on who actually is going to live in them as opposed to who lived in the housing that was about to be torn down, but much goodwill rhetoric about how they'll all be, rehoused in these new operations without looking too closely at it. As you, I suspect, probably know, the orgy of bulldozing that takes place. And again, remember, this is a national phenomenon. This is not just New York, although this is happening overwhelmingly in the old frost belt northeastern industrial cities. and some in Western as well. The consequence is that vast tracts, almost invariably where poor people live, either black or white or Hispanic, are bulldozed. The people who live there, in fact, wind up not being able to afford the rents in much of the new housing that replaces it. Public housing, in fact, does go up, but now it's sort of, barracks type, really stripped down, minimal stuff. They don't put doors on the bathrooms. There's no closets. There's elevators that stop on every other floor. The idea is to not let this compete with the private housing market. There's tremendous resistance from the private housing market. The real estate board centered here in New York City fights tooth and nail against even this degree of public housing. In fact, they say all public housing built by the New Deal in the 1930s should be torn down so we can start all over again and rebuild it by private enterprise, because public housing is things that communists do, and we don't do that here. Secondly, we institute in Title II of this act something called mortgage guarantee programs. Again, all the stuff about free enterprise, love risk-taking, forget about it. They hate risk-taking. And again, why shouldn't they? What the government does is it says, let's assume that Sergeant McGillicuddy is coming back from the war. He'd like to buy one of these new houses out there in Levittown or elsewhere that are popping up, but he doesn't have any money. He didn't have a job before he left. He's not sure he's going to have a job when he comes back. What bank is going to give him a mortgage? No bank. He's too risky. So what does the federal government do? It says, if you bank, give Sergeant McGillicuddy a loan at a certain maximum rate of interest, 4.5% of its FHA, 3.5% of your veteran and Veterans Administration guarantee this, then we, the federal government, i.e. you, the taxpayers, but we, the federal government, will guarantee you, the bank, that if the sergeant doesn't in fact make his payments, we will. So this is a no-lose proposition. Sergeant gets his loan, and off he goes to the new suburbs. Now, of course, it depends on what color the sergeant is, because, in fact, the redlining operations that had started earlier are, in fact, continued. In fact, it's more dramatic even. It's not just that they are literally trying to maintain racially segregated and uniform housing. Not, they say, because they're racist, but because if the wrong kind of people move in, the value of property goes down. We're guaranteeing this property at a certain level. We want to make sure that, in fact, the value is sustained. But they also, in fact, draw huge red lines. There's maps of these. Redlining comes from precisely red lines that were drawn around particular areas. And the particular areas were, in fact, the inner city, because it was felt multifamily housing is almost per se a risky business from investment purposes. So, in fact, the flow of money into these programs and other programs, which is going to basically underwrite and finance the suburbs, is not going to the cities, except for the urban renewal part, which in fact means you tear down poor people's homes and you put up either expensive housing or you put up convention centers and office buildings. So there's going to be a net contraction of the amount of affordable housing available in the city, and there's going to be an expansion of that affordable housing out in the periphery. And now, see, you can get there more easily because particularly after 1953, 56, the National Defense Highway Act. This is the Cold War, by the way, and all of these programs are justified as now in terror than in anti-communism. So if you want to build anything, you've got to show that it's anti-communist. It's maybe a stretch in many cases, but they do it. So the National Defense Highway Act is what builds the interstate highway system. And in New York City, of course, it pours a massive amount of concrete between here and Levittown, known as the Long Island Expressway. This underwriting of the highway program is paid for 90% by the feds, 10% by the states, means that, again, it's no cost to the city as well. It shouldn't be, given that what it's doing is, in fact, making it possible to depopulate the city. Again, the suburban movement is not something that just happens by the decisions of lots of individuals. There are massive political, centralized governmental decisions that are being made that underwrite this. And needless to say, the people who are most happy about this are the giant corporations who have had more than one finger in putting this operation together, whose profits depend upon this. So General Motors And US Steel, which is connected to General Motors, and rubber companies and highway construction companies are giant concerns that are thrilled with the development of this massive system, as are, of course, construction workers, because there are unions involved in this as well, and contractors like Levitt out in Levittown. It is a gigantic set of government underwritten industries, many of them large corporations, that are in fact the key beneficiaries of this boom, plus those people who in fact wanted to get the hell out of the cities. And as we will see, there are other reasons increasingly that white people want to get the hell out of the cities. A word about Robert Moses in all of this. All of this, particularly in Robert Caro's brilliant biography, The Power Broker, is pinned on this one man. It's as if it sprung out of his head. And initially, so goes Caro's argument when he was building Jones Beach and the parkways that got out there, a good-intentioned, public-spirited, progressive era kind of approach to providing public goods to working people, if not to black people, another story. Moses is the good guy who then, for a variety of personal idiosyncratic reasons, he gets too much power, he goes berserk, and he starts running highways through people's neighborhoods, like the Cross Bronx Expressway, most notoriously, which destroys not just poor, ramshackle areas, but vital, lower middle class, perfectly viable housing areas. And in fact is, a madman who eventually almost destroys New York City before he's stopped. This won't do. First of all, it's the great man history theory run utterly amok. I don't think it's all impersonal forces. I think people have a great deal to say. And Moses was a serious player. He was a boss, really, on the order of Charlie Murphy, who went back to Tammany Hall, although he would have been horrified of this because he was a progressive and he was anti-machine politics and he was a Republican. But in fact, Robert Moses was the executor of many other people's plans, and most of them were far more powerful than he was. The history of this in detail is way beyond us, but quickly in the 1920s, an organization called the Regional Plan Administration was established. It was a consortium of the largest real estate owners in Manhattan and the big insurance companies and the big banks and the rest of it. And they had a vision, in fact, for how to develop New York. And the vision was basically get the working class and manufacturing and the port the hell out of Manhattan and turn it into a new, forward-looking, modern arena of white-collar kind of work. Banking, insurance, stockbroking, culture, communications, advertising, public relations, and the rest of it. And also housing for rich people. The rest of the stuff, let's move out of here, out to the outer boroughs or even into darkest New Jersey. And the farther out you get was the heavier the industry. It was a very nice concentric kind of model plan. It was all going to be connected first actually by railroads, but then with the arrival of the automobile by automobiles. And they laid out a series of roadways in the late 20s and the early 30s. When the New Deal arrived and the WPA pumped money into the local economy, Robert Moses was the guy, courtesy of Fiorello LaGuardia, who basically poured concrete along the dotted lines that they had laid out. If you look at the maps from the late 20s, you've got the Triborough Bridge, you've got the Bronx-Whitestone Expressway, you've got the Belt Parkway system, you've got the FDR, you've got the whole schmear. And on the other side of this, when he really is rolling in the 50s, he wasn't General Motors Man of the Year in 1956 for nothing. He is the front man and a power, no question, for the automobilization of the city. This is a titanic state of developments. Remember, this was a rail-based and a ocean freight-based city. And what happens beginning, as we saw back at the turn of the century, but now with a whoosh, the city is in fact rejiggered to make it suburban friendly, and cars in fact have primacy increasingly over railroads, which are allowed to fester, decline, and eventually collapse into bankruptcy. Okay, the other critical aspect of suburbanization and outmigration we've set up already. It's the rise of the Sun Belt. We've seen this coming from the New Deal. We've seen it accelerated by decisions about where defense money is going to be spent during the Second World War. Interestingly, New York City remains a power, and New York City region remains a powerful recipient of military funding through the early 50s. Partly that's because of all of those plants out on Long Island in Grumman and so forth, which are themselves now providing jobs for people and another ground for people to move out of New York City and out to where these jobs are out in the periphery. Also in northern New Jersey, where Ford and Maui and GE and manufacturing plants go up. But with the Korean War, there's a massive shift of federal priorities, and the big money goes to basically where the chairpeople of the defense committees are in the House and the Senate. So you get the L. Mendel Rivers Air Force Base in South Carolina, and you get tremendous flow of money into Texas and to California, which is going to sprout the eventually conservative movement, which is going to squawk bitterly about the role of big government in their lives, as if in fact they weren't utterly and totally dependent on big government, most of the money for which is in fact coming from New York and the Northeast. But with the tremendous flow of federal funds into the domestic military operation and the demilitarization of New York City, which in fact, given our politics, we approve of in large measure, but it's going to mean, in fact, another colossal undercutting of one of the major supports of the economy. It's also going to have a longer-term consequence. Nobody's really quite worked this out yet, but remember I said we managed to roll over our primacy in entertainment/communication from the telegraph to the radio and the like, and we'll do TV in a second. What we don't do is computers. Although we were poised because of all that research into electronics during the Second War. Of course, some of that paid off, and some of it was still in the region. IBM, after all, is upstate New York. The labs out at Princeton, arguably, could be within the New York penumbra where they're inventing the transistor. But really, the big story is that, in fact, the computer arrives in Silicon Valley and not in Silicon Alley. And this has a lot to do with defense priorities. It also has a lot to do with the organization of higher education. We basically blew it, whereas Stanford and MIT were looking for to develop precisely the kind of things that emerged. TV indeed emerges here, not surprisingly. The big radio companies, the big electrical manufacturing companies are here, and the talent pool is here. So what you get is yet another rollover. So, you know, from the extreme, you've got people like George Burns, who starts off in vaudeville and Broadway, and then segues to the movies, and then segues to radio, and then finally segues to, along with Gracie Allen, to the small screen, many of which in fact are made here or in New Jersey. This does not last. Partly, it's a matter of whenever you get the large-scale development of manufacturing on an assembly line basis, then you need more space, then you need less high-priced real estate, and out it goes, either to the wider metropolitan region or eventually elsewhere out onto the planet, like so much else, as we'll see in a second. But interestingly, it's also the content migrates during the 50s. That a lot of the early shows were city-oriented, like so many radio shows were. Remember Captain Hartigan in Eins, Zwei, Drei was listening to the Molly Goldberg show, and lots of these radio programs, the early sitcoms, are set in the Bronx or in Brooklyn. Even during the war, when William Bendix moves to the California airplane production plant, it's still kind of this New York thing transplanted. And Jackie Gleason is in fact the local carrier of that, the local bus driver living in the outer boroughs. But in fact, you can see the suburbanization process taking place on the small screen when Lucy and Desi get into their little car and motor off to wherever it was, Haverford, and various other, Father Knows Best, out in this mythic white bread land, and all that ethnicity, to say nothing of race, disappears from the small tube. Deindustrialization is again wrapped up with the changing military priorities and so forth, and it's an immense story. But in a nutshell, manufacturing peaks in New York City in the, depends on who we talk to, this hasn't been nailed down yet, mid-50s, late 50s, early 60s at the latest, when we are in fact this manufacturing powerhouse. But what begins to happen is a continuation of things that have been happening all along. The garment district has been bleeding away at least since the 1920s. As they move out to Pennsylvania, to coal fields, particularly when they're played out and abandoned, and there's lots of coal miners' wives in the vicinity who can be roped into making manufactured goods, which are then trucked back to the city. The trucking allows, in fact, this kind of early disaggregation to take place. Then, in fact, it's going to move south. Particularly, this is a matter of right-to-work laws, active arguments on the part of southern states that we will give you less taxes. We'll make damn sure, if we can help it, that the CIO and other labor unions don't get down here, and that this remains a congenial atmosphere for your textile operations. And it's not just textiles, it's gazillions of things. Some of this is a matter of benign or malign neglect on the part of the city. Many of our urban renewal programs are in manufacturing areas. Moses is quite cavalier, and again, it's not the only one, to tear down big swatches of Brooklyn where there are factories. Why? Well, you know, this is old-fashioned. We don't do this. This is the modern era. It's the mid-20th century. We're into this kind of white-collar stuff. And they're grubby, and they do have bad record, you know, textiles, sweatshops, labor unions, all the rest of this. Get rid of them. So, in fact, some of this is a matter of virtual city policy. And at the very least, what they're not doing is giving the kind of support and nurturance to the manufacturing sector that they are most definitely giving to the real estate industry. The kinds of things that stay, and lots of them still do, are those things which are A, not requiring huge mass production facilities, B, are somehow connected to brainier things, design elements. So that part of the garment trade, which is into quick turnaround and high fashion, stays. Because it's got to be near the fashion designers who come over and check and rearrange and move. And there's, you know, quick changes of fashion. You need to be able to respond nimbly. You don't want to wait till they truck up from Alabama. So you get, again, a concentration of more specialized, more information-saturated kinds of manufacturing production. Printing stays for a while because of that intense connection with publishing, which stays here for reasons that I frankly still find mystifying. Why is it still here? Beats me. We're just lucky so far. But then there's also the fact that the port leaves. These are all interconnected. One of the reasons that this is such a manufacturing-rich area, as we saw in places like Bush Terminal, is that, in fact, there is easy access to the sea and export markets. And you can easily import the kinds of raw materials that, in fact, you need. Waterborne transport is extremely inexpensive. Waterborne transport, in fact, comes to a dramatic end in the 1960s. I mean, there's two big reasons for this. One of them is containerization. And the other one, with which it's totally connected, is organized crime. Again, we can't begin to do justice to these things, but if you remember you're on the waterfront, it's a pale reflection of the degree to which organized crime had a lock on the port, because in fact, quick turnaround times were required. Ship comes in, it's got to offload fast, unload fast, otherwise it's tied up its capital in waiting times, and it's a real problem. All you've got to do is just put your finger on the jugular vein and say, we're stopping this process. And it's easy to stop that process, particularly if you've got a lot of muscle. And particularly if, you've got allies in the police department and in Tammany Hall and the rest of it. So what you get is this kind of quasi-criminal operation that leeches off the income from the port, and it's considered a business expense for a long time. But if you can get around it, and you can get around it by containerization, which is, again, basically invented here in the city. It's tested out early on in the late 50s, and then whoosh! It, in fact, in an incredibly short space of time, replaces break bulk unloading, eliminates the need for vast numbers of longshoremen, but does require now loading space for all those containers that are sealed and tamper-proof and can simply be craned onto and off of boats. Valuable real estate? Well, where's less valuable real estate? Well, it's in New Jersey. So in fact, basically, to make a long story short, the port moves. And you get, in fact, a legacy of rotting piers along Manhattan and not much better along Brooklyn, with the small exception of the ocean liner component and tourism. But then, alas, whoosh comes the jet airliner in the 60s, and for a long time, although amazingly, it's back. And there's a small stretch of docks now where a couple of weeks ago there were, I mean, not only Queen Mary, although the name really doesn't mean anything, but it's an echo of a glorious past, but a whole series of these behemoths were lined up along the docks in the West 50s. But that's, you know, that's a sentimental relic compared to when this was a functioning port which provided, after all, hundreds of thousands of jobs. They're still jobs, they're just not here, they're in New Jersey. The departure of jobs in industry and in the port has a great deal to do with the civil rights movement and the transformation of race relations and the nature of Latin American immigration, subjects to which I want to turn with horrifying brevity. Big story, big level is between the 40s, 50s, and the mid-60s, roughly 1 million middle-class, working-class whites motor out of New York to the suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them. At roughly the same time, a roughly equivalent number of people, overwhelmingly in the beginning, African Americans from the South, and a variety of people from Central and South America, but overwhelmingly Puerto Ricans, sail or motor in. There's a tremendous shift in the demographic composition of New York City in an amazingly short period of time. And it is connected to two bigger, larger issues from our national and global perspective. And one of them is the alteration in the relationship between, once again, New York City and the South, because you can't understand the civil rights movement and the relations of blacks and whites here and in the country unless you understand that this is the latest chapter in a long-running saga about the relations between New York and its southern hinterland that go back to the days of slavery and the colonial era. And secondly, you can't begin to understand why all of a sudden there is this spectacular immigration. In fact, it's going to reach, in short order, the same level of dimension as the massive European migrations of the 19th and the early 20th century into the city. You're going to get another one, the third great migration movement of people from below the US border in the middle, the southern hemisphere. And that itself is part of the relationship between New York City, the US, and the rest of the world. Okay, we're going to try to at least gesture at a sense of how this plays out. I'm going to focus on the civil rights movement as a way of encompassing these stories. And this is the big point. The big point is that we tend to think of the civil rights movement as something that takes place between 1955 and 1963 and is associated with names like Martin Luther King, SCLC, and SNCC. This is all true, but it ain't true enough. In fact, New York City was an absolutely indispensable major component of this civil rights movement in two parts. One, its relationship with the South, in which it facilitated, underwrote, guided, provided personnel, provided money, provided ideas. It's just not a story which is anywhere near as known as it should be. And secondly, it in fact was the center of a civil rights movement here in the city itself, calling for a transformation of a legacy of race relations that went back for 300 years. This comes in a variety of spurts. I'm going to tick them. 1910s, 1920s. The arrival of the NAACP makes this, in fact, although it's a largely white upper-class reform organization, with the arrival of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the titans of the African-American community of the 20th century, it becomes the preeminent civil rights organization in the United States. Locally, efforts to transform the status quo here go nowhere. The 1910s, 20s are just, Harlem Renaissance to the contrary notwithstanding, a miserable time in terms of black access to the workforce. It's a frozen status quo. 1930s in the New York and the South, critical points are the emergence of the Communist Party, which for all of the slings and arrows, some of them well-deserved, which had been hurled at it, was in fact the premier and virtually the sole white organization in the United States that was interested in fact, improving conditions for blacks. The Scottsboro case, in which they were involved in defending some blacks in the South that had been unfairly accused of raping a white woman, was a dramatic turning point in the consciousness of the city. Bigger still was the fact that the New Deal really did try to transform race relations in the South and failed miserably. Roosevelt perfectly well understood that while he had potential allies in the South on a lot of his economic reforms, particularly against banking, anything that had a chance of altering race relations in the South would go absolutely nowhere. So when Social Security was passed, in fact, it did not include either black maids or black or any other ethnic agricultural workers, because this would have been a threat to the entire Southern racial order. But the CIO, in fact, does understand that there's no way you can sustain a decent wage level in northern cities, given that what's already apparent, the flight of capital to the low-wage South, is an easy escape valve for them. The answer, they said, was raise wages in the South, which in turn means forging an alliance between black workers and white workers in the South to fight for a common economic goal. No easy trick, and no great surprise that it failed, although the effort alone dramatically alarmed the mandarins of the South. Not only mandarins, there was one fellow who was a police commissioner in Birmingham by the name of Connor, who in fact in 1938 writes an outrage letter to Franklin Roosevelt that you're stirring up the niggers and you better cut this out or the Democratic Party is going to be in big trouble. It's 1938, our first encounter with Bull Connor. Up at home, this is in the 1930s, is the time when Adam Clayton Powell, and in fact, in conjunction with communists and the American Labor Party, is attempting to use political mobilization to break open restrictions on labor markets. So, marches on 125th Street, don't shop where you can't work, in front of department stores that in fact refuse access. But it's not just them. The telephone company's got 4,500 operators, not one of them is black. Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, who sells thousands of policies to black working people, not one of them are black salesmen, and so on and so forth. The Second War, the critical moment, the critical turning point. We mentioned already A. Philip Randolph leads the almost first March on Washington in 1941, and a variety of people are pulled into his orbit, most dramatically for future developments. A young man who turns out to be one of the most outsider types possible in American culture by the name of Bayard Rustin. He is a pacifist, and during the Second War, no less. He is a communist until the communists, in fact, made clear that during the Second World War, they are prepared to sacrifice what he had been working on for them, an attempt to desegregate the armed forces. But the communists, once the Soviet Union's in the war, say, oh, no, anything that, in fact, might impede the war effort is off bounds. So he breaks with the communists. He's gay, and this is going to get him in a lot of trouble, and, of course, he's black. So this guy has got, 4 strikes against him, and nonetheless, he becomes one of the key figures both in New York, South, and American history. During the war, however, in fact, at least as important, is his female counterpart, a woman by the name of Ella Baker, who in fact herself has Southern roots, but she's come to the North. She's worked with the NAACP. She wrote a brilliant article in 1936 about the slave market in New York, where black maids would sell their services on the street corner to housewives who would drive by, the same way now immigrant men sell their services as construction workers to whoever drives by. And she became a field organizer for the NAACP to organize local communities. She was into grassroots democracy. much more so than everybody else in the NAACP. But she went out, worked all through the South during the war, and massively expanded the base. It is going to be the base. One of her two T's is a woman named Rosa Parks. It is that base which is established during the war, which is going to be the rank and file people who are really going to pull off the civil rights movement. Up here, that same metropolitan life that's denying jobs in its organization goes one farther, and in the middle of the war, no less, announces that it's going to build Stuyvesant Town, a massive program of privately owned housing, but with government underwriting and support and tax exemptions and government use of eminent domain to tear down old housing. This is one of the first of the bulldozer stuff in 43. Oh yes, no blacks will be allowed in it once it's done. This, in fact, triggers, again, this coalition which has already been operating between blacks and critically Jews in the city. There are pickets, there are demonstrations, there are complaints, no avail at this point in time. Post-war, Truman administration, a critical turning point here. Truman is dancing on the same knife edge FDR was. On the one hand, there's Southern reactionaries. On the other hand, there's the now booming northern cities as blacks begin to pour into those cities, and out from underneath the poll tax and terror campaigns, which in fact kept them completely from access to the polls, or almost completely, in the South. Now they're rushing onto the polls in northern cities, and they're concentrated in great numbers. They're being mobilized by a variety of forces, and there are calls for extending this. There are calls in 46, 47, after the war, for extending the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which now Congress wanted to kill. That was the thing that Randolph had gotten done, into the South. And the Southern leaders, like U.S. Senator Bilbo, bigot incarnate and proud of it, told his colleagues in the Senate about the FEPC law. The niggers and the Jews of New York are working hand in hand on this damnable communist poisonous piece of legislation. Again, the intersection between the Cold War and domestic politics is overwhelming. And that, particularly in the South, but in lots of places, if there's something going on you don't like, labor unions, civil rights, whatever, the easiest thing to do to delegitimiate it is to call it communist. And in fact, often as not, communists will be involved in attempting to further those things, which in fact does not invalidate their importance. The election of 1948 is poised on a knife edge, and one of his advisors, Clark Clifford, who will play lots of roles down in the future, says, you got a choice. You can either pander to the South, or you can reach out to blacks in the North. And in fact, the South is saying, if you don't, go along with us, we're going to walk out of the Democratic Party and form our own segregationist, forever third party. And up in the North, however, Henry Wallace is leading the progressive left-wing party. So they're kind of balanced here. So what's poor Truman to do? He jumps left. And he goes along with outlawing the poll tax. He desegregates the military. And the first time a sitting president has ever done this, he comes to Harlem in the middle of the campaign and makes a direct appeal to the African-American community. That's the high watermark, however, of his efforts, and then he retreats. Eisenhower comes along. We have the 50s. Two aspects now on the New York and the South, as opposed to New York and domestic. There's the NAACP's campaign to work through the courts to overthrow a whole variety of laws, most spectacularly the Brown decision. Here, again, apart from it's the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, again operating out of New York, that's critical. They also rely upon the work of an African-American social psychologist, Kenneth Clark, up at City College, who has been designing a variety of studies that in fact show that segregation is inherently unequal. You can't have separate but equal. But the most dramatic stuff, of course, is in 55, 56 with the Montgomery Improvement Association, the emergence of King. Now, again, King is not to be gainsaid. The local folks, although many of them, in fact, are NAACP activists, like Parks and others. But in fact, it is Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker, in particular, who go down, and King invites them. They invites Rustin because Rustin has been an organizer for a long time around just these kinds of questions. In 1947, he organized for a group called the Fellowship of Reconciliation the first Freedom Ride, where blacks sat in the front of buses to challenge, this is like 14 years before the Freedom Rides that we normally think about. Also, he was deeply involved with Gandhi and the Indian decolonization movements. And King was very much interested in this, and it was Rustin and other New Yorkers who are the link that in fact put him in touch with the Gandhian movement. They also in fact give him financial support. There are Madison Square Garden rallies that raise money for the Montgomery bus boycotters. Ella Baker goes down and actually becomes the executive director of the SCLC. So a tremendous involvement. 1950s up here in New York, two things to note. One, in the aftermath of the Brown decision, there's a movement to, hey, let's desegregate New York City school system. Kenneth Clark, who'd been involved in the Brown case, is one of the leaders of this movement. The Reverend Milton Galamison over in Brooklyn leads boycotts, leads sit-ins, the same kind of tactics that are being used in the South. They don't wait until the 60s. They're here right away, and Rustin and Baker are absolutely in the middle of this movement to get the Board of Education to desegregate the school system. Now, the board's response is, and it's not totally wrong, this is not de jure segregation like in the South. This is an artifact of housing segregation, and we're just into neighborhood schools. Now, apart from the fact that there were some very few people who said, well, all right, let's build schools on the border between these communities so that, in fact, they themselves can reflect alternative racial balances. It was done only once successfully up in the Bronx. The civil rights movement then says, well, okay, but in fact, let's examine housing segregation and notice the degree to which it too is in fact underwritten by the state and by the private real estate industry and by the banking community, and they begin a push which is going to take 20 years to get fair housing legislation passed to break up this kind of basis. And in fact, New York City remains one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Finally, in the 60s, the high watermark of this, New York is in what's developing in the South up to its eyeballs. Ella Baker, who had never been terribly happy carrying water for Martin Luther King and these ministers, works with the students who had started the sit-in movement and organizes SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and in fact calls down New Yorkers, or actually they volunteer. Bob Moses, a teacher, and Horace Mann, in fact, goes to the NAACP headquarters, gets a letter from Bayard Rustin, who introduces him to Ella Baker, and he goes down and he's going to be, in fact, one of the mainstays of the movement down there. 1963, Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, March on Washington, huge story, enough said. 1964, Freedom Summer, Allard Lowenstein, a New York liberal up here, is one of the key people who says the way, in fact, to get national attention is to send white people down, let them get on the firing line. Two of the people who are on the firing line and, in fact, killed are, of course, Goodman and Schwerner from New York, along with Cheney, black from the South. The role of New York black intellectuals, most spectacularly James Baldwin, with The Fire Next Time, with that celebrated meeting in his Central Park West home of Robert Kennedy's, an attempt to bring home to the Kennedy administration a degree of disaffection in the black community are very important. And then the future riding into town, Stokely Carmichael, another local boy, is in fact the guy who is going to preside over SNCC's transformation from civil rights to black power. This is going to be mirrored in New York City as well. It's going to lead to the fragmentation, among other things, of the Black-Jewish Alliance and the great Ocean Hill-Brownsville catastrophe in 1968. At the same time, this kind of interplay between New York and the South is going on. Another kind of interplay is going on between New York and South America. you could tell the entire history of New York in some considerable measure by looking at that connection. I did a lecture at the Museo del Barrio 10 years ago called The Caribbean Connection, which in fact tried to sustain this kind of argument. It goes back to colonial times when the critical connection between New York and the West Indies was what in fact made this town in the first place. But it's in the post-war era that things take a dramatic new turn. New York City, in the form basically of New York City capital, finance capital, but also business organizations, had been playing an increasing, there's no way around it, imperial role in Central and South American affairs forever. One of the earliest dramatic cases was in Nicaragua in the 1850s, when an American who puts together an army named William Walker puts together an army here in the Bowery, goes down to Nicaragua, seizes control of the place, and crowns himself king with the goal of bringing slavery back. He's a very colorful character, but in fact the real story is that he is an agent of two great contending barons here in New York City, one of them Vanderbilt, another one named George Law, who are fighting with each other over the ability to develop a faster transit across the isthmus. This is before there was a canal, and these two rival guys are bankrolling rival armies. And when Walker sets up himself as king in Nicaragua, nobody in America remembers this, but everybody in Nicaragua remembers this, and everybody, in fact, from Mexico south remembers this. Vanderbilt bankrolls himself an army of Costa Ricans and others who in fact invade and overthrow him. But there's a long list of connections after that. The 1898 is when the U.S. now finally gets into the imperial sweepstakes in the traditional European sense. Up till now, we had expanded west. The west was our Africa. Now, not to overdo it, but the frontier is closed, and we leap outside of our borders, and we do so by knocking off the weakest remaining imperial empire, Spain, and stealing a couple of its possessions on the periphery that they couldn't defend. It is true that New York City was the critical base from which the Spanish-American War, our name for it, in fact, was fought. Teddy Roosevelt is a key player saying we've got to get involved in the imperial game. William Randolph Hearst whips up public sentiment in favor of it. But it is also the place where, because remember there was a progressive component to this, where Jose Marti was in fact based, organizing amongst the cigar workers from Cuba and from Puerto Rico, here in New York City, and he in fact was calling for and directing the organization of an attempt on the part of Cuba and Puerto Rico to win independence from Spain. So that was the hope. The reality was, once it was over, and even more bloodily in the Philippines, on the other side of our new little nascent empire, what happened was a massive invasion of U.S. capital. In Cuba and in the Philippines, and then this is going to happen repeatedly throughout the century. It's not just that our U.S. sugar interests come in and buy up huge plots of land and set up giant state-of-the-art high-technology sugar plantations, but they also build the railroads, in fact, to sort of move the goods around. They build roads. They take over the local banking system. Basically, they establish economic, and in a few cases, political protectorates, and these are the bases into which much of U.S. industry is going to expand over the next era. After 1898, we don't do military takeovers, although we come mighty close. Teddy arranges a final solution to Vanderbilt's problem about the isthmus with the takeover of Panama and the construction of the Panama Canal. But after that, we content ourselves with gunboat diplomacy. So we have, in fact, friendly dictators established in power. If they're threatened, if there is resistance to, the United Fruit Company or various Havermeyer sugar interests, then in come the Marines, and they can stay for many years, and do in Mexico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Honduras, Guatemala, blah, blah, blah. Now, the other consequence of this tremendous expansion of U.S. capital into the southern cone is a massive dispossession of traditional peasantry from their homesteads. They can't compete with this kind of massive plantation operations. They don't have capital. They're displaced. They go either to local cities or increasingly they begin to think about, but they can't yet move up to the United States, with one exception, and that is Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico becomes the bellwether of this new development. Puerto Rico finds, after independence in '98, that it's got less self-government than it had under Spain. The peso is replaced with the dollar. U.S. sugar companies gobble up most of the land. The coffee farmers are basically forced out of production. They become an agricultural proletariat. They move into the towns. But they're unique because, in fact, they are part of the US of A. And in fact, in 1917, they're given citizenship just in time to be drafted into the army. After the Second World War, however, is when things really change. It is Operation Bootstrap, a program of rapid industrialization, which lures U.S. industrial companies, notably those textile factories, which had been moving out into the Pennsylvania, into the South, and now are jumping offshore. They're lured with low wages, low taxes, duty-free export because they're inside the United States. And in fact, it's a terrific success. Wage levels, in fact, do go up dramatically. The problem is that the offsetting, ongoing, uprooting of people from the countryside is far greater. And people pile up in Rio Piedras, and they'll work in these factories. But increasingly, one, they begin to notice that, in fact, they can come up to New York and get jobs in factories here that pay a hell of a lot better than they do down there. And secondly, they are now being encouraged to do so by officials on the island and in the States because they want to diminish the amount of potential unrest, of which there have been plenty over the previous 50 or 60 years. TWA, again, the expansion of U.S. airlines, in fact, now fly virtually free. You can, in fact, get here sort of like an indentured servant, in the sense that the company that you work for will agree to pay back Pan Am or TWA over time. This process of, remember, in the 19th century we said that much of the immigration to New York City is coming as a consequence of the expansion of European in general, but particularly English imperialism. In this period, after the Second War, it is actions taken by the United States in the course of expanding its corporate activities overseas that in fact create its own immigrants. We pour into Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans pour here. Capital is exported south, labor is imported north. This happens then sequentially in many other areas. There are different historical circumstances. We can't get into them. Cubans and Dominicans and Panamanians in the 60s, Colombians in the 70s, Nicaragua, Salvadorans, Guatemalans in the 80s. Again, you can tick these off in terms of a variety of changing U.S. economic needs, military and foreign policy considerations, Cold War kind of issues. There are many different stories, but in each case, what's happening is a growing expansion of access into local markets, local uprootings, and then consequent settlements. By the 90s with NAFTA, this is now uprooting in Mexico in particular on a colossal scale, and there's a new source of in-migration. When Puerto Ricans arrive here in the late 40s and the 50s, they are arriving just as manufacturing and dock jobs are leaving, the same, in fact, as those blacks who are being pushed off the land in the South, where mechanization of agriculture is also going underway, are arriving. Jobs are much harder to find. Poverty rates are, in fact, higher. Again, it's a matter of bashing your way into a particular niche. This is the niche economy business we've talked about repeatedly. So, and you generally tend to start at the bottom. So there's waiters, kitchen workers, maids. The garment industry is in fact going through a transformation. So in fact, blacks and Hispanics begin to replace the Jews and Italians who had been working in it before. Taxi drivers, hospital, the growing healthcare industry, workers, apartment maintenance, and some small businesses like bodegas. It's also a matter of finding your niche in housing, which means that, in fact, Puerto Ricans begin arriving. They move into Italian East Harlem area. There are battles now between them. This is the period of gangs, and we notoriously associate the gang fights with, the dangers of the new Puerto Rican menace, which has arrived, out of which is coming West Side Story and other things. But in fact, what's happening is, as often as not, they are organizing themselves to counter the organized assaults by Italian gangs who are freaked out that newcomers are coming into their territory. A classic story, once again, of battle over access to scarce resources. And it's not as if, in fact, this is a uniform Latin American world which is arriving here. It's got their own conflicts. The Puerto Ricans are here, solidly established, and then come the Dominicans, and there's battles over who's going to, in fact, own the bodegas, and the Dominicans win. They took over the car services. There are battles, again, similar to those that took place between the Irish and the Italians, only now it's the Dominicans, the Mexicans, that are in the basement of the churches, or there's battles over whose virgin will be in the front of the altar. Guadalupe, Providencia, Altagracia, the Cobre. These kind of cultural struggles within inside these communities. On the other hand, there's also the beginnings, at least from the 60s on, operations like the Young Lords are part of this, where there are attempts to put together alliances between different cultures and countries down there that here are the beginnings of an outline of something called Latinos or Hispanics. All of this doesn't even begin to address, I won't even try, the fact that in 1965, in large measure as a result of the Civil Rights Movement, there is finally a overthrow of the immigration restriction laws that were put in place back in the 1920s, and the whole world is thrown open to immigration. Which, in fact, over the next 20, 30 years starts arriving in enormous numbers. Often, in fact, once again, in response to some kind of action or initiative of the United States out in that part of the world. So Koreans are not unconnected to the Korean War. Vietnamese are not unconnected to what happened in Vietnam and the like. The 70s. The long post-war boom, which starts during the war and continues with some interruptions, little blips here and there in the 50s and the 60s, but basically the longest sustained period of post-war prosperity in American history, peaks in 1969 and then begins to drop sharply. Reasons: one, the revival of Europe and Japan, the defeated enemies who in fact actually modernize with the latest plant and equipment, begin to undercut American profits. Two, Vietnam, empire is costly and we don't even pay for it, we just borrow, which inflates the dollar and lowers the value of the dollar on the global economy. Three, once again, usual business cycle stuff. We have saturated the affordable purchasing power with cars and so forth on the new malls. Massive levels of corporate and private debt to keep the boom going, but eventually there are limits. And it is the oil shock which in fact only sends things over the edge. It wasn't the Arabs' fault. We had been living on incredibly cheap, undervalued energy because basically the military balance of power between us and them allowed us to sustain that. When it goes over the edge, and when you get a massive, and it's a global fiscal, it's not a local fiscal crisis, which is the way it's usually talked about. I think that's a profound misunderstanding of what's going on. It is true that New York City borrowed, like many other cities, like many other corporations, like many individuals, from all too willing banks who were making money hand over fist on the fees that they were doing for loaning this. But it was in fact not dramatically more profligate, somewhat more profligate, because it had the tradition of the New Deal. It had things like the City University, and other places did not, but it wasn't dramatically out of line. What you had was a global crisis, and the question was, as usual, who's going to pay for it? And the banks, who were wildly overextended to Latin American countries, to East European countries, to corporations, and to New York City decided to start with New York City. There were bailouts for big corporations. There were no bailouts for the city, at least at first, dropped dead, and the city goes into massive crisis, near bankruptcy. The solution is austerity programs imposed by the city's creditors, who basically abolished democracy. A financial control board is established, which has the right to tear up all city contracts with its workers, the right to insist on the shutdown of services, and the right to insist on priorities being assigned to city income, notably pay back the banks. That's your number one priority. So, in fact, not surprisingly, the police force is cut, the fire department is cut, the school system is cut, repairs and maintenance on transportation and bridges is cut, city workers are laid off in enormous numbers, welfare rolls are crunched or frozen, so that with inflation, in fact, the value of income going to poor people drops dramatically. I've mentioned, I can only sort of re-mention it, that in my judgment, that this kind of austerity program, which had an odd echo back in the 1930s, in fact is the roots of, on the one hand, the development of the Reagan approach to national policies in the 1980s nationally, and also the program that the International Monetary Fund establishes around the world of, in fact, imposing requirements that you, A, shut down as much public services as you possibly can, stop supporting and underwriting, like cheap bread and so forth, and concentrate on paying back your debts to the IMF and to the banks, in fact, beyond it. The question then is, how do we get out of this? It's beyond us in our remaining time, but in all about? Well, I think there's two things. One of them is that, in fact, this remains, even as it loses industry and as it loses the port, it remains the center of global finance. It's got competitors. London and Tokyo, remember, in the 1980s in particular, are serious rivals. But nonetheless, it is one of a handful of cities which, as the global economy gets not invented, but newly integrated, and there's a massive flow of trillions of dollars of capital looking for profits sailing around the world, much of this is headquartered here. Some of this is, in fact, also sheer speculative shenanigans, again, as it was in the 20s. If there isn't enough productive investment that's possible, then you speculate. And this is the period of mergers and acquisitions, of takeovers, of green mail, of basically the transfer of assets. Now, it's not increasing production, it's not increasing real wealth, but it's making a hell of a lot of money for investment bankers, for the accountants who are on both sides of these takeover deals, and for a whole host of associated business services on down to Xerox operators and computer stores. So, in fact, some New Yorkers, in fact, do spectacularly well. And those bonuses are enough to, in fact, raked off by income tax to fuel at least some measure of upgrading of public services, although just sort of barely. Then it all comes unhinged in '87. And they start up again in the 90s. And once again, an awful lot of what's happening with the emergence of hedge funds and new ever trickier financial instruments is that ways are figured out, very brilliant ways of making money without actually producing anything. Again, the ramifications of this on a global scale can be enormous. So when money goes rushing into whatever, Thailand, and hangs out for a while, and then, oops, the Thai baht is weak. Well, we're out of here. Whoosh! And off he goes somewhere else, leaving behind a, devastated local economy, or Indonesia, or here today, gone tomorrow is the motto. It may be wreaking havoc here and there, but in fact, it is making fortunes here in New York City, which then has its correlative in real estate, because in fact, new round of office towers go up, although fascinatingly, not in Lower Manhattan. hence the zeroing in, to use a dreadful metaphor, on our final issue. Lower Manhattan, I said, had peaked back in 1911. Then it had a run for its money with the space race between Chrysler and Lower Manhattan Company in the mid-20s, which it lost. 30s, nothing's getting built. After the Second World War, with the tremendous expansion of American corporations who now move out into the planet and set up conglomerates, and much of it is investment in South America, much of it is investment in, more of it is in fact investment in Europe. There's also, not utterly unconnected from other events, tremendous amount of investment in the Middle East. The Middle East, why? Because of oil, which in fact we had been the net exporters throughout the Second War. It had been our pipelines. We ran a pipeline during the war because of all those U-boats who were sinking oil freighters, the lifeline for the armies in Europe. A pipeline, the Big Inch, was built all the way from the Texas oil fields to the New York City harbor. But that pipeline is going dry. The pipeline actually was dismantled and sold off. But the pipeline, metaphorically, is going dry because, in fact, the Texas oil fields and the Oklahoma oil fields are going dry, relatively speaking. At the same time, there are massive discoveries of oil under the desert sands in the Middle East. And it is American oil companies headquartered here in New York City. The oil exchange is here in New York City. And the banks, which in fact are the financial outriggers of these operations, are here in New York City. David Rockefeller, the head of Chase Manhattan, the inheritor of the Bank of Manhattan Company all the way back to Burr, is in fact interested in expanding New York and American capital presence abroad, and finances heavily the involvement in the Middle East, very much in tandem with the State Department, who of course are underwriting deals with a variety of unpleasant local people like the Shah of Iran, anybody who will in fact guarantee the ongoing flow of inexpensive oil back in this direction. And that connection is not unnoticed by many people, in this case in Iran, who are not very happy that when in fact the Shah flees, it's in fact to New York Hospital that he goes, courtesy of David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger. But you get this tremendous expansion of these skyscrapers that are housing all these operations, most of them in Midtown. Gulf and Western Building up here on 59th Street, one of the great conglomerates of the 1960s, now a Trump colossus. David Rockefeller is really freaked at this because, in fact, Lower Manhattan, where he and his family and his bank have invested a lot of money, is looking to be a ghost town. So what does he do? Well, first he in fact builds Chase Manhattan Plaza, a massive commitment. He organizes all of the remaining banks and insurance companies that are in the area, although most insurance has fled up to Madison Square and other points. And he's going to make a last stand, but he's going to make a last stand at public expense. And basically, he, together with his brother, Nelson, who just happens to be the governor of New York, arranged for the construction of the World Trade Center, using the Port Authority and the old plan announced back at the end of the Second War to develop a World Trade Center. But in fact, this is no longer about world trade because the port isn't here. It's gone to New Jersey. What it is, as was complained about loudly by the owners of the Empire State Building in Midtown, is a colossal real estate deal where public tax money is going to underwrite this gigantic mess, which Rockefeller and co. are hoping will provide the critical mass to allow Lower Manhattan to make a comeback. Most people said this is a disaster because there isn't demand for this, and they were right. In fact, there is massive vacancy rates there. Also, they suck tenants away from other buildings in Lower Manhattan. It is not until the late 1990s that the World Trade Center finally begins to make a profit, at which point they privatize it, not totally unintelligibly because it wasn't paying any taxes, and they make this lease with Larry Silverstein, and within weeks the planes hit. And why do they hit? Well, this is a big issue here. The official argument is that they hit because they hate freedom. And because this is, an open society and all the rest of it. But, why didn't they hit the Statue of Liberty if they wanted to make that argument? Or if they were upset about our cultural and sexual mores, why didn't they, level Times Square or Hollywood or something like that? I don't think so. I don't think so. No doubt that's part of the mix, and we're dealing here with a variety of theocratic fascist thugs are part of the story, no question about it. But it pays to listen to what they say they're doing, which is that they are hitting the economic and, remember it was Washington too, military capital of an American empire, which until recently dare not speak its name, which is in fact supporting a variety of regimes in the Middle East, to wit, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel, which they detest. Rightly or wrongly is not even the issue. It's the way they see the city, which is in fact not wildly out of sync with, in fact, the realities of the way relationships between New York, the United States, and the rest of the world have evolved. Is this in the faintest smidgen justifying this? No, that's not the issue. The issue is to understand as best we can. And I think if we assume that, and it's the poor World Trade Center, because, and all those poor people who were in it, because, in fact, this was not the center of international banking and the oil industry and all the rest of it. It wasn't quite as much as the Empire State Building, which is largely populated by dentists. But a whole variety of kinds of operations are based there, most of which have nothing whatsoever to do with this. But in an odd way, because it was turned into a symbol, the symbol of resurrection of the financial community and America's position in the global order and the rest of it, it became something that in fact it wasn't. There's no answer to this. You don't dismantle your economy, but you at least pay mind to, in fact, the context out of which this comes, which is a conversation that, still is virtually impossible to be held. The future. Well, I won't even try. I'll just say the following. You're going to get a copy of a little book that I wrote after September 11th when I got very much involved with a whole variety of organizations that are attempting to extract whatever is possible out of this nightmare catastrophe that can redound to our collective benefit. And so there are a lot of movements who are talking about rebuilding and revitalizing not just Lower Manhattan, although that's important, but in fact the entire city, and to use this horrible caesura in time as an opportunity to consider where we have been and where we are and where we should in fact be going. And the kinds of things that have been talked about a lot, and I've tried to summarize in that book and won't try to do here, is the degree to which I've been talking about, the degree to which it seems to me we have become dangerously over-reliant now on just one pillar of what used to be a multi-pillared social and economic order. The financial system, when it's on a roll, is, a moneymaker almost by definition. And the bonuses sort of fertilize much else in the economy. But when it's not, which is often, in fact, that contraction undercuts our major source of income as the public sector as well, and sends devastating consequences throughout a society which does not have the number of fallback positions in manufacturing and the port and so forth that it had once upon a time. Ergo, a call for a rethinking and a diversification of our macroeconomic policy. There are a whole variety of other things, but I have overstayed my welcome. So I will just say that I have been enormously pleased to work with you. My hat has been off to you people, and we've been working now with teachers for about 5 years and had several conferences before this, nothing quite on this order of scale, for which I want to echo the applause, but to all of our participants. I don't know about you, but I find this, among its other virtues, well run in the extreme, particularly in the sense that all the pieces of it are integrated one with the other. So there's follow-up, there's a variety of ways of coming at the same program. But ultimately, my hat is off to you, because it is not easy being a teacher in this beleaguered, now in upheaval school system, and it is not easy if you have a passion for New York City, because in fact the system is not congenial to it. We are hoping that you will be, in part, the agents of transformation, not just that you'll come up with great stuff in your classroom, but that your collective weight and presence throughout the system will begin to make itself felt, so that we can begin to talk about a political renegotiation with the city, and more to the point, with the state, to increase the amount of attention and time allotted and space on test exams that is given to New York City history and to U.S. history, because in fact we think that it is in the interest of our students, the future citizens of this city. So I applaud you. Thank you.